Okay. Oh my gosh. Hi, welcome back, or welcome if you're new. My name is Rachel. I am a self-published author and a small business owner, and today we're going to go into depth about a few of my products. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the writing Bibles and the task planner, and we're just going to go through step by step what's in these, how to use them, all that kind of stuff, just to clarify any kind of confusion. The number one thing I want to say about the writing Bible is that the writing Bible is not meant to pressure you into making sure that you have all of these details filled out. I don't want anyone to open this and look through the pages and start feeling anxious because they don't know these things and they don't know the answers to these questions yet. I don't want anyone to do that, to feel overwhelmed by this. I want this to help you, not hinder you. So as you open these and start using them, just remember that this is meant to be a place where you can document the things that you know and a place to inspire you to ask questions about the things you don't. But it's not meant to be something where you have to fill it out page by page, section by section. You have to fill in every response to everything. That's not what this is for, because that's how I felt when I initially opened it and started using it, like the final version of it. I was like, I don't know half of these things, and I started freaking out until I reminded myself and realized that that's not the point of this. The point isn't to sit here and be perfect about it and fill out every single section. The point is to have all the sections you might need to keep track of the information that you know. Just as like a little reminder, my favorite author of all time, J.R.R. Tolkien, did not write big, long, crazy histories and world building and all these kinds of things and then build a story around that. He wrote a story and he built the world around it. That's why he wrote draft after draft after draft after draft of The Lord of the Rings, because every time he wrote a draft, he realized things that he needed to include in the earlier versions or earlier in the story, different parts of the history he needed to flesh out. It wasn't like he had this perfect Middle-earth history planned and then wrote a book. They go hand in hand. They learn from each other. Your story and your world building, they learn from each other. So please don't feel like you have to have this all written down perfectly before you can start writing, because you don't. That's not the intent here. So I just want to make that very clear. So that being said, let's talk about the writing Bible. There's two versions. There's the fantasy and the general fiction. The fantasy and sci-fi has just a few more sections than the general fiction does, and the general fiction has a few less pages in certain sections than the sci-fi and fantasy does. So I just want to kind of explain the differences between the two. There's also digital versions of both of these, and the digital versions are the exact same as the physical. So let's go ahead and look at them. Okay, so we're just going to use the fantasy one as kind of like the overall like blueprint, and then I will explain when there's a difference between the two rather than having them both out here. So let me zoom in just a little bit so you guys can see better. Okay, so your writing Bible has a table of contents that shows you where everything is in the writing Bible. Of course, if you end up rearranging pages and stuff, this will no longer apply, but you could just use whiteout and redo it if you wanted to. So the first section is your series details page. So your series details page is basically a spot for you to write down what is this series going to be. This could be for a series of standalones or a series of like, you know, a trilogy or whatever. So here we have where you can put the series title, the genre, the number of books in your series, and the number of point of views. And then we have the series tie-in. So, like if you have standalones, what's the tie-in between the standalones? Is it that they just take place in the same location? Do they have the same trope? Do they have the same theme? What like ties them together? Or is it like one series with the same main character? Or is it multiple trilogies within the same location? Like, because you could have a series of standalones. You could have like a series of like 3, like a trilogy or like 7 books with the same characters. Or you might do, like K.M. Shea, for example, has the Magaford series where it's a bunch of trilogies set in the same world. So there are lots of different ways that you might define a series. And then here we have a list for the book ideas. So the book, you don't have to know the name, you don't have to know any of these things, but as they come to you and you start to think about your series, you can write down, just like a phrase or something or some kind of code name for the book to help you remember it, and then just like the basic idea of it. And I have an example here. I tried to have examples throughout the whole thing so that everyone would kind of be able to figure out what I was talking about. And then there's also brainstorming page space next to that. So then you have the details for each book individually. So you have book 1 details, same thing, title, what number is this in the series? Is this the first book, the third book, the 7th book? How many POVs are there? And then the type, is it a novella? Is it full length? What are we working with? And then I made a list of trope ideas just to help you get like brainstorming, and then made a section for you to list out the tropes that you want most to use in your story. And there's also more brainstorming sections in case you have other things you want to note at this point in the planning that I didn't write down. And then you have it for book 2 and book 3. I only did 3 books because any bigger and this thing would be ginormous. But I will say that at one point, hopefully in the fairly near future, I am going to make inserts so that you could buy like the series planning pages or the series plot or arc or the main character page. Like you could buy one section at a time so that if you need more pages to stuff in here than what I gave you, you can buy the extra and put it in here as well. So that will be coming in the future, just so you know. So then we have the series plot arc. And this is more so for people who are writing a trilogy or some kind of series that has the same characters throughout. Because if you have a series of standalones, you probably aren't going to be having an overarching storyline. Or maybe you do and it's very subtle. But either way, this is where you would track your series plot line. So, for instance, there's a difference between the plot of The Lord of the Rings as a whole versus The Lord of the Rings, Fellowship, Two Towers, and Return of the King. So there are spaces further on in the book to plot out each book individually, but there's also this space to help you plot out the overall arc of the story if you have a story that kind of lends itself to this. So the 3-act structure, I think most people know what it is, but in case you don't, stories are divided up into 3 pieces: the first act, the second act, and the third. Technically, it's divided into 4 because there's Act 1, there's Act 2 Part 2, Act 2 Part 1, Act 2 Part 2, and Act 3. And there's different points along the 3-act structure that are somewhat universally agreed to. However, you'll notice I did put them in really, really faint light gray so that if you want to put different ones, or you want to name them differently, or you want to describe them differently, you can. So there are certain things that are just true for everybody, like the climax is down here, the resolution, the beginning, the midpoint. Certain things just exist in every story, but still you might call it something differently. You might put a different percentage mark for yourself than what I put. If that's the case, you can just write over what I did. That's why I put it so faint, so that if you don't want to use those, you don't have to. And then here we have the plot your section story. Like I said, don't think that you have to have everything perfectly filled out, like chronologically as you go through. This can be something that you leave for now and come back to later. But the way it's set up is that you have Act 1, Act 2 Part 1, Act 2 Part 2, and Act 3. And essentially, you could do it in multiple different ways. You could write down like a paragraph of what you want Act 1 to be like. Or you could write down just some bullet points of different plot points that you want to happen within Act 1 and within Act 2 Part 1. It's kind of up to you, but this is just to help you get a bird's eye view of your story. And I do describe that here. That's what this is me telling you kind of what this is for. So it's kind of put your ideas in order chronologically of how they're going to function throughout the course of your series. Hopefully that helps. There's also some note-taking pages here. And then we have book 1 planning. So these sections here are the same for book 1, book 2, and book 3. So book 1 planning. And I built this kind of around the way that I personally plot a book. And so what I like to do is I like to write down all of the ideas I have for the plot. Every scene, every daydream I've had. I'm not trying to force myself to plot out the whole story here. I'm just writing down all the ideas that I have in general for the story and all the different plot moments and scenes that I foresee happening or that I might want to write. Completely out of order. There's no rhyme or reason to this. It's just a space for you to write down all of your ideas pertaining to the book. But again, you can use this however you see fit. You could just use it for notes if that's what works for you. But it lends itself into the 3-act structure, which is the same setup. This is set up exactly the same way, and this is set up exactly the same way. And if you did write down all of your plot ideas here, you can now take them and put them in order in the 3-act structure. What do you want to happen within each act? Like, there might be one scene that you're like, oh yeah, that's definitely going to happen somewhere during the climax or around the climax, so it should go in Act 3. Or this scene is definitely somewhere in the beginning, so it should go in Act 1. This is not meant to be like everything is in perfect order, but that it's in the right act more so that you can kind of get an overall idea of how the story is going to start flowing for you. But again, if you don't like that, just take some whiteout, cover that up, and write these notes or whatever. Whiteout is your best friend. And if there's at any point in this process, if you look at these pages and go, that doesn't work for me, totally fine. Put some whiteout over it, some sticky notes over it, or some washi tape, and do what you want with it, because that's what it's for. Here we have the book notes. This is for outlining. I figured most people probably aren't going to need more than half a page per scene. So I think there's something like 32 half pages here. But if you're not someone who likes to outline, you could just use this as notes paper or whatever. There's lots of it here, but that's what it's meant for, is for you to do your outlining. But if that's not something that works for you to outline this way, you could totally do something else. I didn't want to actually separate it like scene by scene, because in case someone doesn't want to use it that way, but like if you were going to use this as outlining paper and you wanted to do one scene and one scene, you could just use highlighters, to be like, okay, draw a box in here and that's scene 1, draw a box in here, that's scene 2. Like, that's how I would probably do it. And then we have the same sections for book 2 and book 3, literally the same setup. Okay, so then the last 2/3 of the writing Bible is all of the more tracking pages. So first we have the side character memory bank. So this is for characters that you aren't focusing a lot on right now. You don't need to know their backstory. You don't need to know where they're from. You don't need to know any of those bigger details. You just need to know broad strokes, their name, what's their role in the story, and what's their general description. So that's what this is for, is those kinds of characters, which I find that I oftentimes have a lot of, and they might come back up later. So I need to remember, this guy had brown eyes. You have those pages. All of the information I've shown you so far is also in the General Fiction Writing Bible. They're exactly the same in every regard thus far. So then we have the main character profile pages, which the only difference here between this writing Bible, the fantasy science fiction one, and the general fiction is the fact that the fantasy science fiction one has 6 main character profile pages and the general fiction has 4, just because generally fantasy and science fiction tend to have larger casts than general fiction does. The other differences are that in the fantasy science fiction we have a place for species/race, and I didn't include one for the general fiction because you don't usually need to know what species somebody is in a general fiction story. But those are the only differences on these pages. So we have their name, species/race, their date of birth/age, eyes, hair, height. Most of this is self-explanatory. Their job or role in the story, their birthplace, current location, and their relationship status. Then we have character traits. So I put down some kind of ideas for different character traits. I find this section helpful for brainstorming a character when I'm first getting to know them, like somebody is sassy, or somebody is shy, or somebody's outgoing, or somebody's a ladies' man, or just kind of broad stroke traits to kind of get me figuring out who this character kind of is. And then we have a very short section for appearance, because I figured there's really not a whole lot to say once we've already said their eyes, hair, and height. It's kind of just their overall vibe. And then we have their family and other relationships. So I debated doing like a family tree setup, but family tree setups are really hard when you're making them universal for everybody, because it's hard to know how many like branches people are going to need for different layers of the tree, so it can get really convoluted really quickly and really challenging to do for everybody, like to make it universal for everybody to use. So instead I did this setup. So this could be for family members, it could be for ancestors, it could be for friends, romantic relationships, whatever. But there's a place for the person's name, their age, the relationship to that character, and any notes about them or that relationship. So I'll list out the family members, or I might list out their enemies, different things like that. Then we have key life events. So there is a space later in the writing Bible for timelines and important dates. But for this section, I just made key life events. So the most impactful things that have happened in their life. This is something I've been doing for years, is like the top, sometimes I do like the top 5, the top 10 things that have happened to them and at what age, that informed who they are, or things that you might need to remember for the sake of the story, would go here. So the date and the age they were and the event that happened to them. And then there's a section for notes at the bottom. And then this right here is for the growth of your character and the story. So I find that sometimes making sure that I have emotional growth for my character can be kind of hard to keep track of. So this way I could plan it in advance and kind of try and somewhat keep to that kind of plan. So we have book 1, book 2, and book 3. And you have emotional shifts, and then we have the acts, Act 1, Act 2, Part 1, Act 2, Part 2, and Act 3. So basically the emotional shifts would be like somebody starts off as some kind of like very independent, I don't need anybody's help, loner person, and then by the end of the story you're wanting them to or maybe the end of the series you're wanting them to turn into someone who willingly relies on other people and has healthy relationships. And so it'd be like point A to point B and the journey they have to take to get there. So I would write down the emotional shifts that I want to see in that character, that way, because sometimes it's hard to make sure that you're showing the emotional shifts in a character in a story. It's hard to remember that part because it's not necessarily always documented in the plot. So it just is helpful in that regard. And then plot shifts or realizations. So, at different points in the story, what is my character going to think about this situation, or how are they going to react to it, or what kind of domino effect is it going to have on them, especially if they're the main character, like especially around this section, the midpoint. How are they going to react to the midpoint? How does it change their perspective or change their personality, or like what's the domino effect? So that's why I have emotional shifts and plot shifts both, because to see how they change emotionally and to see how they change in relation to the plot as the story goes on. So hopefully that makes sense, but because that's something that I have a hard time keeping track of. And then we have a vision board. With the digital, it's probably easier to make a vision board, but honestly, I don't mind printing out pictures. I do it a lot, and I'll put the picture there, like, maybe I have a character inspiration photo that could just take up the whole page, but sometimes I might want to make like a collage of different photos that make sense for that person. And actually, I would probably make it on Canva first and then print it out and just cut out the collage so it's just one picture. And then we have a note section, and then we have the same thing for all the other main characters. And like I said, there's 6 in here and 4 in the general fiction. So then we have supporting characters, and both the fantasy science fiction and the general writing Bible both have 6 each for this section. So it's basically a simplified version of the main character profiles. You have the space for the name, species and race, date of birth and age. All of these things are the same. But instead of having all of those like key life events, relationships, all this stuff, you just had the vision board and a space for notes. So it's just a very, very simplified version for supporting characters that you need to know some things about, because you're going to revisit them later for a different story or whatever, but you don't need to know everything. And then we have setting details. So the general fiction only has 2 setting detail sections, and the science fiction and fantasy one I think has 7. So basically, because with a science fiction or fantasy story, I figured you might have like up to like 7 different kingdoms that you need to recall details for, versus with a general fiction, you're probably not going to have more than 2 settings that you need to remember a ton of information about. So they are slightly different in that regard. They are set up a little bit differently too. On this first page here, for the science fiction and fantasy, we have the place, so the name of the place, the population, the type. Is it rural? Is it coastal? Is it a city? And then the general climate. Those sections are the same, but then things get different. Here we also have species and races, and the government type, whether it's a monarchy, is it an anarchy, is it a democracy, what kind of situation are we talking about? This section is not included here because obviously general fiction, you're probably not going to need that information. And then notable characteristics. Is it small town? Is it religious? Is it strict? Is it like anti-magic? Is magic part of like the social hierarchy? Different things that are just kind of going to stick out to you about your story. And both sections, or both writing Bibles, have a section for that, but the general fiction is smaller, just because you're probably, with the general fiction, you're probably talking about a city, versus with the science fiction fantasy, you're probably talking more so about like a country or a larger area. And then here we have resources. So do they have access to fishing, mining, etc.? But on this one we have just important landmarks and important people and the title and role they have, which this section also has those, but this one is just much smaller because you probably aren't going to have a ton of landmarks, and you probably aren't going to have a ton of important people in relation to the setting that you need to remember. So those 2 things are different. And with the general fiction writing Bible, we move right into the map and the vision board. And then it's the same thing for the next setting. Versus with the science fiction fantasy, you have the resources, and then we go to the relationships with other places. So like with your different kingdoms or your different cities, you might have some that are allies, some that are enemies, some that are indifferent toward each other, some that they team up when it's necessary but they don't like each other, and that can have an impact on the story. So I wrote those, gave a section for that. And then there's a much larger section for important landmarks, because chances are you're probably going to have ruins or space stations or something going on that you need to keep track of. Again, I'd like to reiterate, you don't need to know any of these things in order to write your story. You don't even need to know the name of the place you're going to write about before you start writing. I just want to make that clear. This is not supposed to be like a prerequisite to writing a book. It's supposed to be a tool to help you during the process of writing the book. As you keep working, you know, you might want to look back and be like, oh, wait, what resources does this place have? And then you might be halfway through the book before you ask yourself that question, or you really start thinking about it. But now you have a place to write it down at. I don't want anybody to think that they have to know all of these things before they can write something, because it's not true. I mean, full transparency, I have this writing Bible, and the only things that are filled out for me are the species and the main characters. Everything else I just fill in as it becomes applicable, because I didn't want to take the time and stall myself, because sometimes I think the need for having all the information in advance is our way of kind of stalling so that we can wait longer to do the thing that scares us, which is write the book. So I just want to make it clear, like, yeah, I'm selling this writing Bible, which sure is part of my income, but really I want this to be helpful to you, and I don't want it to hinder you. So please don't look at it as I have to fill out this whole thing before I can write anything, because that's not at all what it's for. It's to help you, not slow you down. Okay, so then we have creatures. So, and I put it in the settings section because a lot of the time in sci-fi and fantasy, you're probably having creatures that are natural to one area versus another. However, there is space later in the writing Bible where you could write down more creatures if you need more space for that, or more plants, or more whatever that you didn't have enough space for here. There's more places in towards the end of the writing Bible, which I will point out when we get there, so just so you know. And then there's important people, so the title and the role. There is another section in here for government, so I wouldn't overthink this too much. This is more so like if you have a president or a king or a queen or some kind of I don't know, maybe a judge or somebody that's kind of important to the history or the story, you could write them down here. They don't necessarily even have to be in order because you do have other places to write that stuff down later. And I do believe there are 7 government and species pages to correlate with the setting pages, just so you know. So there are 2 things here. There's a vision board as well as a map, because with sci-fi and fantasy, most of the time the settings you're talking about probably don't look normal. So for me, not only is it important to have a map where I know where everything is, it's also nice to have a vision board that tells me the colors, or what the buildings kind of look like structurally, or what the scenery looks like, so I can kind of in my mind be able to revert back to this while I'm writing to remind myself kind of what the story or what that setting includes. So then you also have the map and then a notes page, and that is the setting, and there are 7 of those. And like I said, at some point in the near future, I will sell these pages like in separate chunks, so you could buy extra setting pages to stuff in here if you have more than 7 settings. So don't get your panties in a bunch about it yet, because I will get there. And then we have specific location details. Both writing Bibles have 4 of these sections. So the specific locations details page is for a specific location rather than an entire town or country. So let's say it's for a specific castle or a specific, like if you're talking about the general fiction writing Bible, maybe it's for a school or somebody's house, some kind of location that we visit fairly frequently within the story, but isn't like a city. It's a smaller piece, if that makes sense. So you have the name of the place, whether that be like a certain castle or somebody's home or something. The type, is it a house? Is it a store? What is it? Where is it? What is its importance? Like, how is it related to your story? Why do we need to know about it? Its general appearance. And both of these are the same for the general fiction and the fantasy. Both setups are exactly the same. And then we have a vision board for that section and a map. And then some more notes. So it's not supposed to be like something where you would need to note the resources of that area, because it's so specific and small that, you just need to know basically where it is and what it is. Or you might need to remember at some point that you said that the inside was painted green or whatever. So this section is only in the science fiction and fantasy writing Bible. This is your groups, government, and species. So the reason it's titled Group, Species, and Government and not just Species or just Government is because not every fantasy story or science fiction story is the same. Some people won't have multiple species, they'll just have one. Or some people won't have multiple governments, they'll just have one. Or some people might have like military groups and some people might not. So I wanted to make sure that this was kind of applicable for everybody. So that's why it's called those 3 names all together. So there's the name of whatever it is, whether it's a group, a species, or a government, the location, the origin, how did it start? This is applicable for all 3. How did your military group start? How did this species come about? How did this government come about? Where did it come from? And then notable characteristics about them. Non-combative, militant, wealthy, hospitable, strict, religious. What kind of adjectives describe this group to you? And then here is this is the one spot where it depends on what you're using the section for. So, and I write it here, if you're documenting a government or group instead of a species and you don't need to list abilities and limitations, then I recommend using these pages to track people in your group or to track historical events that pertain to your group. Because on this next page, we have important people or positions. So you might need more room than what this provides. So you could use this space, or you might need, there is a timeline space in the back here, but maybe you want to write some events that happened historically for your group, or maybe there's phrases your group needs to know. So there are different ways you could use this. It's here basically for species, their abilities and limitations, like magically or technologically, depending on what kind of story you're writing. But if this doesn't apply for you and you're talking about a government instead, then that's what I would do here, is write down important events or important phrases or whatever makes sense for you. But I would just use some whiteout and put your own words over it if you're not doing abilities and limitations. And then here we have important people or positions. So the title of their position and the role that they fulfill within the government, the species, or the group. And I tried to include as many of them as I could. Like I said, if you need more space, though, you could use that previous section. Then we have rules and laws and who enforces it. I'm sure this could be like a whole book of this section, depending on the world building you're doing. But like I said, you could use that previous section to write down more rules and laws if you needed more space. There's also a notes page that you could use if you require more space. And there's also space in the back that you could use that I'll show you in a second. And then relationships with other cultures or groups. So this, I think, is applicable to all three groups, species, and government. So the group that you are talking about, so if you're writing about elves, how do they get along with dwarves? You'd write down dwarves and the relationship they have together, whether it's combative, whether they're allies, whether they're indifferent to each other, whatever that is, because that might impact your story. Remember, none of this is required. It's all just here if you need it. If you don't need that section, ignore it. Put a sticky note over it. Put some stickers on it or some washi tape. Do not pressure yourself to fill out every section just because it's here. And then appearance. If your group has a specific appearance, and I think this also applies to all three, because if your government has certain uniforms for different positions, you can list them here. Or if your species has a certain appearance that's different from other species, you could put it there. And then a small vision board. Then there's the magic and power system. This also is just in the science fiction and fantasy. This is not in the general fiction one. And the magic and power systems. I put magic and power because you might not call it magic. You might call it something else. You might be doing something like Star Wars with the Force. It depends on, your vibe. So first we have the name of whatever your system is, your magic or your power. And then how it works. So who can use it, the abilities they have with it, and the limitations they have with it. I feel like this was the simplest way to kind of be able to cover everybody. So, you would write down maybe elves, what they can do with their power and what they can't, or, what Jedis, what they can do with the power, what they can't, and kind of dependent on your world building there. And then you have the rules and laws and who enforces it, because you might have laws that pertain just to your magic or power system rather than a government. And then the appearance of the magic or those who use it. So if your magic has any impact on the visibility or like the way somebody looks, or maybe magic has a color, or maybe it looks like strings, or maybe it's, potions, or what is it? You could describe that there. And there's only one section of this, by the way. This is the end of it. And that's because I figure most places are going to have one power system that will be used differently by everybody, but usually you're going to have one. And then important people or positions in case there's some kind of like semi-government setup within your magic system, and then some notes. These pages I printed out this morning, and they're on the wrong paper because the ones that I needed for this I didn't have. So please ignore the fact that they don't look the same. It's because they're not. Your pages won't look like this. They'll look like this. But then it goes into spells, potions, and creatures or technology. So basically this section is if you need to document a language or vocabulary of some kind, or spells or chants or charms. Like in Harry Potter, you might need to write down different spells, or you might need to write down different potions in the recipes, or a language, or maybe you have technology, you need to keep track of the different objects that you've created. Or if you need to keep track of more creatures and you didn't have space for that before, but you need more space now, or maybe your world has a lot of laws, or whatever it is that you need basically more space to document, this is where I put it. And I put dotted lines, that way you could determine when you want a new section. So the item, the word, the spell, etc., and then the ability, the meaning, or the cause. So like you could put, for instance, if you're doing spells, you could put expecto patronum, and then what that spell does. And then if you're doing creatures, it could be a basilisk, and its bite is fatal, and if you look it in the eye, it kills you. Different things like that. Or if you need to put like a law, you could put like, what is the name of the law, or maybe who enforces it, and then what is the law. But the reason that there's dotted lines is so that you can put a line wherever you want it and write in that it's a new section. So like you might want one section for creatures, one for spells, one for potions, one for technology, whatever it is you need them for. That's why there's these kind of blank grids so that you can do with that what you want. And there's multiple pages of that. And then there's also timelines and important dates. Okay, there we go. That's much better. So timeline, important, and dates. This section is in both binders. So timelines and important dates is in the science fiction and fantasy as well as in the general fiction. Just want to make that clear. And essentially, the timeline and important dates is if you wanted to track the history of a certain culture and you didn't have space for it before, or you wanted to track the history of one person's life, or you just want to write down dates and events as they come up in your story, like historical events that are mentioned in your story, you want to write them down to remember them, you can do that here. And I did the dot grid again so that you can start a new section or separate them however you feel is necessary for you. That's literally everything that's in the Writing Bible. And like I said, the goal is to make your life easier, not more complicated. So please don't feel like you have to fill out every section in here or that you have to fill it out a certain way. Like, it's meant to be whatever you personally need it to be, rather than, you know, oh, you have to fill out every section or you're going to flunk out. My hope is that it's customizable for everybody, so I hope that I explained it well enough. But if you do have questions, please put them in the comments below. Real quick, we're going to go over the task planner really fast. It shouldn't take super long because this one's pretty self-explanatory. So the weekly task planner is a planner that's for everybody because it's not necessarily about writing in particular or budgeting in particular. It's just general planning. There are 2 overall sections for the task planner. So we have a yearly overview for 2024 and 2025. We have a project idea bank, which essentially is for you to kind of put ideas down that you're not ready to pursue right now, but you don't want to forget about. So the idea, the possible date, and any notes about that idea. This could be for book ideas. It could be for home project ideas. It could be for whatever you want it to be about. And then we have project 1 details. So there are 3 project sections in here. I will probably include inserts for this as well eventually when I get there, where you can buy just a certain pack of inserts and put them in case you need more. So the details pages is where you're going to write down what your project is, the start date, the target due date. I put target because due dates are really helpful because they give you like a timeline. They give you a little bit of pressure to get things done, but they can also be really detrimental because they can be overwhelming. So I wanted to make sure that to remind people that you don't have to stick with the due date you pick, and you don't have to be done by the due date you pick. So that's why I put target. People to contact. So there might be a person or place that you need to contact. Maybe like if you're writing a book, you might need to contact someone about a cover or an editor, or maybe you need to contact a contractor or a babysitter or whatever it is for whatever project you're working on and the date you want to do that by. Important websites. I don't know about you, but I will forget all the time what websites I was using for what. If I don't, even like if I bookmark them, I'll get confused on what they were for. So this way you can write down the website you were using and what it was for. So like, for instance, as a small business owner, you might get one product from one website and one product from another. So you might need to write down not only the websites, but what products they're for. Or maybe if you're doing a renovation project, what store, has what items versus what store has different items, that kind of stuff. And then just a really simple budget for this project in particular. This is not meant to be like a budget for your entire life, just for this project. The item you need to buy, where you're going to buy it from, how much it costs, and then a check mark spot to check it off once you've bought it. And there are 2 pages of that. And then there's a note section. And then we have the tentative schedule for project 1. So the tentative schedule is to help you figure out the overall scheme of how your schedule is going to go with this project. Oh, excuse me. But I did write in here that if the due dates are stressful for you, then just ignore those columns, because I contemplated just doing the task and the estimated time that task will take, because those 2 things I think are very important to know. But I contemplated not having the start and end dates, because I know that for me personally, those are overwhelming. I used to be very anal about them, but now I kind of don't touch them because they just make me anxious, because if I don't start and end on those exact days, I get overwhelmed. But I know that some people really, really like that. But that's why I did make that note that if those columns stress you out, ignore them. If it were me, like for me and my planner, I don't use these columns because they stress me the heck out. So it's like, nope, I am not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. Not happening. So we have running to-do lists. So this is basically to keep track of all of the to-dos you have to do for a certain project. They don't need to be in any specific order. They don't need to be necessarily broad or specific, whatever works for you. If you just want to write down, write rough draft or make a list of all the materials needed for this project or whatever. If you want to be more broad about it, you can. If you want to be more specific about it, you can. There's a couple of pages in here for that. And then the task tracker. So the task tracker is something that I've been doing for about 9 months or so now. And I was using just like grid paper. And then after I made this, it's so much easier for me. So it's going to depend on who you are. So, and I wrote down on here that the task tracker is meant to track the time you spend on each task or step in your project. The reason I like to track the amount of time it takes me to do things is so that when I want to do the next project, I can look back at this one and estimate how long it's going to take me because I have the evidence to show me how long it took me last time. That's why I really love this. So basically, the task block column is going to represent whatever time frame you want a task block to be. For me, I call a task block 25 minutes because it gives me 5 minutes of transition time into whatever I'm doing next. You could make it 30 minutes, you could make it an hour, whatever it is, just be consistent about it. So you would decide how long you want a task block to represent. With me, it's 25 minutes. And then once you've used up that span of time, you're going to either check the task block space or color it in or whatever, put a sticker there or something to show that you used it up. Write down what the task you did during that task block. And if your task ends up taking up multiple blocks, you can use multiple lines and add them up in the total column, or you can write the number of tasks in the task block column. So for instance, let me grab mine real quick. So for instance, this is mine. Right now I'm rough drafting, and so I've been writing down how many words I write or revise every day because I write a chapter and then I go back and kind of loosely revise that chapter. It does not count as my editing, revising phase. That will be next. But so I write down that it took me one task block. I wrote down 765 new words. I know what project this is for because it's in that certain project section. And then the date I did it on. And then once I'm done rough drafting, I'm going to add up all of the task blocks I used for rough drafting, and I'll write the total in the total column. Oh, there is a date column. I just haven't been using it because I'm dumb. But then I'll write down the total in the total column. And the nice thing is that what I can do is I can write down the total. Like, let's say it takes me 100 task blocks to write the whole rough draft. I can add it up, put down 100. I can add up all the words I wrote, and I can divide it up. And I can say, okay, I wrote 100,000 words. Divided by 100 task blocks means that I wrote, on average, 1,000 words per task block, which means that when I go to plan my next book and decide how long it's going to take me to write it, I know that based on the last book I wrote, I can write roughly 1,000 words per task block, which means that I can plan kind of tentatively how long I think the next book will take me. That's why I like this system, is because I can do the math and figure out how long it took me and how long it'll take me next time. I hope it doesn't overwhelm anybody. I feel like it could be really overwhelming, but I really like that section. So, and there's 3 of these for each project. So each project has all of those sections. And then we move into the months. So I have all 12 months listed here. There's an undated monthly calendar with a note section. And then there's 2 pages for a habit tracker, which are also undated. And what I do is I write down the habit and then I just color in the circle when I've done that habit that day. Or I guess you could, if you wanted to, you could write down the actual days, like the numbers, and then highlight it when you're done, whatever you want to do. So I have all of the months are set up that way with the monthly spread, the 2 habit trackers, and then the next month. And then at the back is all the weekly task lists. I set it up this way because some people might want to have just just the task lists by themselves section together, because maybe they set up their task lists once a month, once every other week, a couple times a week, whatever their situation is. But some people might want them just every week. So if you wanted to do them every week, you could take these out and put them in each month. So you could put 4 to a month, you know. So December would have 4, November would have 4, whatever. Or you could keep them by themselves. That's why I separated them, was to give you the option of whatever you want to do personally. The weekly task list is literally a glorified to-do list, because this is my favorite way to plan, has been since college, where I will literally kind of just brain dump everything I need to do, everything that needs done that I can think of, onto my task list. And then I will highlight it one of two ways. Either I will highlight it based on category. So like, let's say home related stuff is pink, business related is blue, writing related is green. And I will go through and I will highlight all of the different items based on what category they fall into. Or I'll highlight them based on high energy and low energy. So I might do like high energy is pink, low energy is green. And so the things that will take more energy or more focus and time, I'll highlight as pink. And the things that take a shorter span of time or are less stressful to take care of, I'll make green. So you could do it however you want to do it. You could do a different category, has its own page. Like this could be home stuff, this could be business stuff. That's completely up to you. I wanted it to be up to you so that you could figure out however you want to do it. And of course there's a due date and a check mark to check it off when it's done. And there's a year's worth of one a week in here. And like I said, I will have inserts that you can buy separately and put in more if you need more. So yeah, that's the weekly task planner. And that is how you use the writing Bible and the task planners. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the comments or send me an email. I'm hoping that that was self-explanatory enough, but if it's not, yeah, please send me questions. And I hope that if you do buy a writing Bible or a weekly task planner, that it genuinely helps you and makes things easier and less intimidating for you. But just remember, you don't need any of these things to write a book or do whatever project you're working on. These are tools to give you the confidence and like the clarity to move forward, but you don't need them. You're perfectly capable on your own. So just know that. And I'm always rooting for you and hoping that you succeed. And you know what? You're succeeding just by starting. So anyway, thank you guys for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.